Hey, welcome
Hi,
everyone.
welcome everyone. Welcome to the first of 4 events in the Photography is series. For these events, Foam Photography Museum Amsterdam has joined forces with the an Amsterdam-based platform and laboratory focused on internet and digital culture, to explore together how the internet has reshaped photography. My name is Winke Wiegersma. I work at Foam as a curator for a digital platform called Foam Explore, where we curate a wide selection of exciting and interactive content.
And my name is Lillian Stolk, and I'm running the and tonight I'm here with my colleagues Margarita Osipian, who is moderating the chat, and technician Marco, who is arranging everything you see in the live stream backstage. And in the coming hour, we have an exciting selection of speakers lined up for you. But before we dive into the conversations, we will quickly bring you up up to speed on the ideas and inspiration behind this event series.
Yeah, so the first photograph to ever appear on the internet was uploaded 32 years ago by Tim Berners-Lee, also known as the inventor of the World Wide Web, precisely on July 18th, 1992. It showed a Photoshop montage of portraits of his colleagues at CERN, which is the European Organization for Nuclear Research, where he worked at the time. And until that moment, the World Wide Web, the internet, had been text only, and in fact was intended to be text only.
And now, fast forward 3 decades, and we've been inundated by a relentless flood of digital images. With cameras just a pocket away, we constantly produce digital images. Digital media has given birth to new types of imagery, such as screenshots, selfies, and memes. And the internet's network nature has not only led to an image overload, but also created an ideal environment for images to spread rapidly. So it's not about the image itself, its aesthetics, but also how it lives on the platforms, how it's triggering an algorithm, and how it's speaking to an audience. In apps like Snapchat or BeReal, we're communicating with just photographs. The internet has redefined photography's traditional boundaries, transforming images from just representations into active participants of our daily lives.
So, in an age where images seem to be everywhere, the definition of photography morphs and evolves quicker than most of us can grasp. Over the past decades, we've seen countless of new formats, topics, and themes that birthed out of the internet and emerged within the photographic landscape. Spearheading this exploration, we have, for instance, the artist Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, who already as early as 1994 made her visionary work Seduction of a Cyborg, where she comments on how digital imagery will start to flood our worlds. Testimony to these changes, as a photography institute, for the past few months, Foam actually exhibited a group exhibition on artificial intelligence, which actually had its last day today, featuring a wide range of artists working in the in-between land between AI, algorithms, and photography, such as Alexei Yurinev, Christopher Mirdo, and Bree Suthers. All of this led us to ask, what even is photography nowadays? In this rapidly changing context, it seems futile to want to pin the photographic medium down to one definition. And instead, with this series, Photography is ... we collectively want to explore the different possible endings to this sentence, which in fact, we will do together at the end, in order to better understand the multitude of manifestations of this medium and to speculate what might come next. And today, our first attempt to complete the sentence is, of course, reflective.
Yeah, we will pause and look back in time. What can the past tell us about photography's future? And building on the medium's inherent reflective nature, it felt appropriate to look backward to the future, to examine our past as a way to look ahead. This reflection is especially timely as we seem to be entering a new era of the generated media. The vast number of images we've shared online has been used as training data for large language models, allowing us to create photographs without even holding a camera by simply entering a text prompt.
To do so, in preparation for this event, we went back to the archive of Foam magazine, the magazine that we've been publishing for many years now as an institute. And we went back to see what was written about photography on the internet. And one edition specifically, the issue Curating the Future, What's Next? Holding it here, published in 2011, reflected precisely on this topic. At the time, this issue actually marked the 10th anniversary of both the Photography Museum as well as the magazine itself. And in celebration of this, focused on what was next for photography, photographers, and the Photography Museum as an institute. And in dealing with this question, it soon appeared that there was one topic that they couldn't circumvent at the time, which was the internet. Together with a pool of inspiring artists, thinkers, and curators, including contributions by Liko Shiga, Anne de Vries, Penelope Umbrico, and Ramesh Raskar, Lev Manovic, to name just a few. And of course, our three wonderful speakers of today. The issue aimed to look ahead in time, speculated on what the democratized and network landscape of the web could mean for photography. I want to read a little quote at the start of this magazine. It was written down by Marloes Grijnen, director at Foam at the time. She wrote, "In recent years, the digitalisation of the medium brought about fundamental changes that have redetermined our entire visual culture, utterly transforming what we consider to be a photo, the way a photographer organizes his or her professional practice, how photo editors work, and how countless amateurs make, distribute, and share photos."
Yeah, so the magazine was published in 2011. Maybe it's good to realize the state of social media in 2011. In that year, Facebook was growing fast with millions of users, but Instagram has just started. It started in 2010. I remember the early days of Instagram, that it was actually an app mainly used to add a filter on your photo. It was not so much about sharing. But by 2011, quickly, it became more popular for sharing photos as well. Social media was shifting to focus more on images and how people shared them, with a little concern still over privacy, and there was a lot of optimism about the future. What was interesting to us when we were reading Foam's What's Next issue was that there are a lot of themes, ideas, and questions that are discussed in that issue that are topics that we're still thinking about and trying to understand today. And this made us wonder, what has happened in the past decades? What did we actually learn, and which answers did we get? So in this first of four event series, Photography is ... We are revisiting Foam's What's Next issue, and we've invited three speakers that contributed to the magazine, as Winke was already saying. Good to know, all the contributions of the speakers today, like their articles, they can be found on a Miro board that we created for this event series, and that Margarita will also share in the chat now. Later, we will invite Constant Dullard and Fred Richin into the screen, who in the magazine had a conversation about photography and the internet. But first, you will see a presentation by Marissa Olsen. Marissa Olsen's work combines performance, video, new media, painting, drawing, and installation to address the cultural histories of technology and wellness, experiences of gender, and the politics of participation within pop culture. She coined the term post-internet during a 2006 panel organized by Rhizome, and it quickly gained traction across various contexts. For the 2011 Foam issue, Marissa wrote the essay Post-Internet, Art After the Internet, which was actually an update of an essay she wrote in 2008. For tonight, we've asked her to again reflect on this essay. So please give a virtual applause for Marissa Olsen, and I want to invite Marissa to the screen.
Hi, can you guys see me? Oh, there we go. Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm Marissa Olsen. I am here in New York where, in typical New York style, there is construction going on outside, which is affecting the speed of my internet. So I do want to apologize in advance if my connection is slow. I also want to thank all of the organizers for having me, including Marco, who is going to be sharing his own screen in order to share the Google Doc from which I'm presenting, because my screen sharing is not working. So I've been joking actually recently in my last few talks that there's Moore's Law, there's Murphy's Law, and then there's Marissa's Law, which is that the more explicitly you're talking about technology, the more likely it is to fail. And I am really starting to believe that that's true. So let's talk a little bit about technology. From my screen, the colors look different, which is funny, but it doesn't really matter. I just want everyone to know that it's purple, not tan. So hi and thank you. My talk today is going to be divided into 3 sections. Let me just give you a preview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm only speaking for 10 minutes, so I'm going to be speaking pretty quickly, and then there will be a Q&A at the end. I'm going to quickly describe some of my previous work that just relates to today's conversation. I'm also going to discuss post-internet and a bit of what it means or what it meant when I first coined the term in just general terms. So for those of you who've never heard it or don't really know what it means, don't worry about it. It's just going to be a light conversation. And then I'm also going to discuss the current moment in photography and its evolution. And if there's time left, I'm going to raise some topics for future discussion, maybe give you some unexpected examples, including I'm interested right now, I've been doing some work on what I call time-based collage or parallax collage, and might even talk about Neuralink, so just some previews. Again, hi, thank you for having me. It really means a lot to me to be invited back in this context. That particular essay that I wrote for Foam, there's no way I could have anticipated it, but it has now been translated into many different languages and republished in many different publications. And because of that, it's meant that I have this really special relationship to Foam, even though we haven't really kept in touch until this moment. And I'm hoping that we continue to keep in touch. I think that it really says a lot about Foam's place in the world of photography. I wrote in my original Foam article that whenever you put a post in front of something, it does complicate things, and it definitely did. So, wait, I'm already jumping ahead in my Google Doc. Let's back up, and Marco, those 2 external links that I gave you, let's go to the first one, the monitor tracings, and then we'll go back to this thing about post-internet. So I'm going to show you 2 different bodies of work that I've done over the last few years. One is the body of work that I was working on when I first coined the term post-internet. And this is a series called Monitor Tracings. And Marco, you can just kind of slowly scroll down over these images. This is from a platform called Arena. If you're having trouble seeing any of these images, it's because they're very faint mechanical pencil drawings on paper. Marco, feel free to click on maybe one of the top ones. The crappier images tend to be the easier ones to see. But these are images where I did Google searches for defunct technologies, now defunct, pulled up the image and traced the image directly off the screen. And I was thinking about the way that technology has always sort of assisted people in creating images, even if we didn't always see that technology. So even if someone was using a camera obscura or an overhead projector in their creation of a painting or another type of image, we may not see it, but they couldn't have created that image without that kind of optical device. And so I feel like the Google search, and somebody told me yesterday that using Google as a verb is now like totally played out, but so I have to think about that. But in any case, I feel like the search engine was maybe the next part of that evolution or that trajectory in using devices in the creation of images. Moving on to the next external link that I shared with you, Marco, there's time capsules. And this continues to be an ongoing series for me. This also draws on my interest in training in the cultural history of technology. And again, you can just scroll down over this page and you'll see that I've again taken objects that were once really coveted, kind of commodity fetishist objects. They went from being identical assembly line objects to really personal objects that we had intimate individual relationships with. And then they became garbage. And I've taken them out of circulation, tried to prevent them from having a life in a landfill, and painted them gold, almost like the gold bars in Fort Knox, which is where the US keeps its gold bars. And there's a lot more to it, and we don't have time to give an artist talk about this whole body of work, but the idea is that it was sort of a responsive body of work thinking about both the climate and our individual relationship to technology. So we can come back to the Google Doc now. Excuse me. But what I was thinking about was the way that these individual technologies and the conditions of their production and their reception could almost be like time capsules in and of themselves that encapsulated all of the fears and fantasies that we had at that specific moment in time when they were invented. And also, they sort of encapsulated everything that we wanted them to represent for us. And so when I was thinking about post-internet, I was really thinking about the internet in that sense and how a work of art could really be responsive to the internet. So let me go back to just kind of reading you what this document says so that I don't veer off too much, because I can have a tendency to ramble. So I wrote in my original foam article that when you put a post in front of something, it does complicate things, and it did. People very much misunderstood my intention and screamed in a real "leave Britney alone" voice that the internet was not dead, and therefore post-internet was bogus. On the contrary, what I meant by using the post was that it was like a post in postmodern, or after the fact, meaning as a result of or influenced by. So as I said in a recent right-click save roundtable, to paraphrase myself here, once we entered the era of postmodernism, it didn't mean that modernism was over or dead. It actually meant that we were hyper-aware of modernism. Postmodern works self-reflexively engaged and critiqued the conditions and affects of modernity in the same way that post-internet works engaged and critiqued the conditions and affects of the internet. But I will come back to what I was saying. I know I'm speaking really quickly. One of the points that I'm trying to make there was that people sort of decried what they perceived as my point, that the internet was somehow dead and that's what post-internet was about. However, I think there's, in the question of what's next that's being raised in this Foam and the series, I think there is an evolving way to look at this term. What I find interesting today about this statement is that the internet is no longer a thing, i.e. a network. It's a ubiquitous enveloping set of circumstances. So I've previously pathologized it as having a set of symptoms or network conditions, as I used to say. And I would backpedal on that now, just given my deeper immersion in the disability justice community. I don't know that pathologizing is the right way to approach it. But I would say that when we discuss the meaning of post-internet today or next year, we should think about the meaningful work being made today and what I'd call the CDE, or the current digital era. So being a nerd, I like to think about, there's BC, et cetera. There's the CDE, the current digital era. And that work addresses questions of digital equity. So because the internet, as the World Wide Web, is in fact now becoming obsolete, but it has always been part of and parcel of a larger lattice work of technological innovations born as state apparatuses of communication, surveillance, ideological transmission, and repression, of which the market, the art world, and academia are simply three related pipelines. So really, we can kind of open a mental tab here, speaking of discussion points, as I said earlier, to come back and think about all of these things that post-internet was already post-industrial, post-ideological, etc. So coming to this third point, how am I doing on time, you guys? I didn't see when I started. Do I have a little more time? Oh, great, my screen is frozen. Okay, I'm gonna keep speaking until someone tells me to stop speaking. So now let's shift course and discuss the current moment in the photographic trajectory or photographic evolution. So I'm coming at this from two different places. When I was first invited to this event, I wrote a quick spiel on AI, and as I described it to the organizers, it focused in particular on the ways that our current discussions of AI mirror not only post-internet conversations, but also the anxieties that arose in the early days of cinema and how those two are related, AI and early cinema anxieties. So you can open another mental tab here for us to come back to. But when it came time to pick a few images to show you, in addition to this colorful Google Doc, I couldn't help thinking about all the recent tests and procedures that I personally have been going through as a cancer patient. So the reality is that it's interesting to me that there are several forms of photography, going back to the root of the word itself, sort of light-based writing or light-based imaging, currently hiding in plain sight that simultaneously invoke both the history of photography and raise questions about its future. So here I'm just going to give three really quick examples of medical types of medical imaging that are light-based imaging, but they're side by side with kind of, I think, classical examples from photographic history. So on the left, there's a Laszlo Moholy-Nagy photograph. Okay, am I out of time? I heard some. Okay, I'm gonna try to be 1 minute? Okay. Maybe I'll just scroll past these. There's a photogram on the left and hyperspectral imaging on the right. On the left, there's an image from Michael Light's 100 Suns, which are nuclear tests. And on the right, there's nuclear imaging of brain death. On the left, optical tomography, and on the right, a photograph from the Mutter Museum. And then here, finally, we see examples of, no, excuse me. The top ones are both hyperspectral imaging. Then we see nuclear imaging. Then finally, optometrical tomography, which is kind of 3D imaging. And I've given it with the example of the matrix bullet time layout and then 3D printing. So there's not time to read the riff that I wrote about the similarities between AI and early cinema, but I'll just read these two kind of discussion prompt questions that I wrote. Is the fable of AI that grows out of control and kills us all the same as the mythos of the frightened audience running from the film of the incoming train? A tale meant to both intrigue and scare audiences into relinquishing dollars and control. What's the difference between Neuralink and a camera? I'm sorry, there was a lot between here and there, but maybe we can come back to it. Thank you so much.
First of all, how was it for you to be asked for the second time to reflect on an earlier writing?
Well, to be honest, I've been asked to reflect on this particular essay many, many times. And I think that is an interesting testament to the fact that people have read this particular issue of Phone so many times, which is great. I never expected people to read this essay so many times. You can never predict that something is going to go viral in that particular sense, and it really means a lot to me. I think that all of the points that you made in the beginning of your presentation have been really relevant to people, and I think that it does speak to the ubiquity of the internet in people's lives. But I think what's interesting is that whereas in the beginning there was this critique of, oh no, the internet is so ubiquitous, we don't know if post-internet is a relevant term. Because there was this misunderstanding. I think that now the internet is, as World Wide Web, really is kind of fading and being replaced by these other forms of networks. So it's interesting to see how it's evolving.
Yeah. I was actually reading an article on the platform Do Not Research by writer Twee Wister. And they argue that post-internet period, after the post-internet period, we've now entered actually a new era that we can call, or they call it internet core, which became more evident due to COVID pandemic, when in real life activities got erased and the internet was the only place where we could be. And they described the difference with post-internet, that the internet is no longer an alternative nor an intersection of reality, but pretty much, the only existing reality. And
one thing that's really sad about that at the same time is that the internet has become so much more homogenous, and it used to be critiqued for that when I don't think it was as homogenous as people used to say. But now when you have the big 5 tech companies all further merging, I think the internet is a lot less interesting and exciting than it was in the heyday of the pro surfing era, for instance. There's a lot less interesting content that remains on the web. I think Olia Lealina's artwork and her writing in this area is really, really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand what you say. Yeah, it's also that it's really adopting. Like I think the what so continuing what they were describing as the internet like a quote from the article is that he described the artist as a hacker during net art, a surfer during post internet, and a poster during internet core. So. Yeah, really art produced in and for online platforms.
Yeah, when I was working at Rhizome, we would talk a lot about the idea of whether people were pushing or pulling from the internet and what that meant in relationship to editorial platforms, how people really wanted to access content. And I think there's no one monolithic internet user or no one monolithic internet artist or artists even. So everyone uses it in different ways. And I think it's dangerous to say that all people use things in exactly the same way. But I do think that it's true in this, what you're calling an internet core, or this person's calling an internet core era. There's a lot more posting and a lot less response. So a lot less kind of engagement, a lot less community. It's a lot more like spewing of posts and a lot less remixing or engaging or thoughtful response.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah. It's interesting how, I think there are some communities, but maybe it's more in like smaller niches and behind closed walls instead of on the big public platforms.
Yeah, I do think that there's been a return to offline communities like chess clubs and reading groups and other kinds of like even crafternoon clubs, things like that, which I'm all about. I'm really into that.
Well, thank you so much, Marissa. We'll come a bit later in the screen. Give a warm applause. There are actually emotes in the in the chat or below in this tree where you can give a virtual applause to Marissa. Thank you so much. And it's time to go to the second part of the event and invite Constant, Fred, and Wienke to the screen.
Yes, thank you so much, Lilian, and thanks, Marissa. On March 19th, 2011, a selection of experts met up at FOAM in Amsterdam. Among them were Fred Ritchen and Constant de Laart. Fred Ritchen is Dean Emeritus at the International Center of Photography School, where, in fact, I believe he's teaching a class as we speak. In October this year, we're all very excited. He will release his fourth book on photography and the future of imaging called The Synthetic Eye, and we're all anticipating that. He's joined by Constant de Laart, working as a conceptual artist for many years. Constant is currently director at Distant Gallery, an online art platform, as well as professor of networked materialities at the ADBK Nuremberg in Germany. Welcome, Fred and Constant. We're very excited to have you two meet for the first time after 13 years, after your conversation. At the time, you engaged together in a dialogue about the wide web of the photographic world, it was called. And the central question was, in this conversation, was how to deal with the huge volume of pictures shown in the media, online and through social media, which gained momentum around that time. This, we could say, is a question that has only become more and more relevant. Yet we could also maybe say we grew accustomed, or dare I say addicted, to the flood of images surrounding us today. In the summary of your conversation, it stated, the search for possible answers must begin with a general notion of what we expect from images. Fred, to start off, back then you answered this question with, we want images to be credible. Could you explain what you meant by that and what has changed since 2011, or what do we expect from images circa 2024?
At that time I was talking about images being credible as witnesses, so that you can see a photograph of something happening far away and you believe that something like that happened. If they're not credible, then the most vulnerable people are the ones who suffer. For example, in the Vietnam War, there's a big argument that because the credibility of the photograph showed a 9-year-old girl being napalmed and burning, and other images like that, the war ended sooner. There are thousands and thousands of people alive because of photography. You could argue that apartheid ended earlier in South Africa because of the photograph of Hector Peterson, the young boy who was killed by security forces. Nelson Mandela said, once I saw that image, I knew that we had to end apartheid. You could argue that the photograph of Aylan Kurdi, the 2-year-old boy from Syria who washed up on the beach, his body, he was drowned. A lot more refugees were accepted in certain countries, much more money was raised, and so on. The counter-argument, for example, is the United States, the longest war in history for this country was 20 years in Afghanistan, and there are no iconic photographs. There's no photograph that helped people to resist the war, rethink the war, do something different. And I think right now it's an error to think of everything online as photographs in terms of having a link to that reality. I think many of them are fabricated. I think we've entered the era of computational photography versus optical photography, meaning 92% of what we call photographs are made by a cell phone. And in cell phones, the software automatically, quote unquote, enhances the image. So you don't get what you see. And now with artificial intelligence, you make photorealistic imagery of anything you want. You could see images that look like they're real from Gaza, from Ukraine, from anywhere. And somebody could be sitting in their living room in Amsterdam and make people look good or bad. You flood the images with that, which is what's happening. The prediction is in the next few years, the great majority of imagery online will be from artificial intelligence. The new artificial intelligence systems will scan the older images and so on. And then we're going to have a distortion of history. We won't know what happened. We won't know contemporary events. And we can't call those things photographs. We're talking about images of all kinds. And we're way behind, both in schools and governments and corporations, in figuring out ways of separating out those different kinds of images at this point. So I think that when we were at FOAM and we talked about what's next, we didn't see to the extent that the ecosystem, the media system represented by photography would collapse as completely as it has.
It's quite a scenario that you paint there, Fred. Constant, how do you feel about this? How do you respond to this? Also in light of actually your comment at the time, which said, in practice, I'm not particularly interested in the authenticity of the image. What I find interesting is to add layers of meaning to photograph to show the complexity of the experience of the depiction. Can you relate that to what Fred just elaborated on?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm very happy to be in such weirdly networked but still close proximity to Mr. Richin. I wanted to quickly link it to this whole post-internet thing because I was once in a discourse also in the museum where the artist Oliver Larrick posed kind of like a way of like after a while, we'll start to look at art that happened before the internet more than what happened after the internet. As in that there was such a crucial kind of like a momentum going on, and like how that's still being debated right now. I completely agree with what Fred just said, that it's actually, we become aware that there was like a brief blip in time in which we had that relationship to depiction, that a technical relationship to depiction, and that we completely reverted that back into, or we are reverting that back into completely, or a new, but maybe already known for centuries before, way of engaging and consuming visual depiction of the world around us. As in painting, having to rely on like the distribution, having to rely on distribution systems and verifying certain facts beyond, let's say, the technical truth of like a photographic depiction. And in that sense, I think what I said at that time is that I was interested in layers of context, on the layers of distribution and the layers of like where an image comes from, where does it reside, how it's distributed. But by now, of course, you get the level of like what how the image came to be. Let's say what informed, if you look at like mechanically engineered or synthesized images, I would prefer to say synthesized images. If you look at these synthesized images, you would just want to understand all the information that went into it and the models that created it and who authored these models and how flexible are these models and how they're consumed. Is it like a black box model that was delivered by basically like a venture capital exercise like OpenAI? Or is it something that came from like open source communities in which you can cycle between the different types of models? I mean, the brain works like we are like emotionally, like our emotions are like informing how we look at the world. Just like these models are like getting information on like how we look at the world. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening, but it is concluding a kind of episode in how we deal with depiction, yes.
Yeah, and with the synthesized images, of course, when we're talking about generated images, AI generated images, we actually don't really know anymore what happens in these algorithms, and like you say, what data they are trained on, and also how they make certain choices in this generative process. But also to what extent these AI systems that are now producing synthetic images are not also being trained on synthetic images, right? Is that correct, Fred?
Yeah, but I think it's much more than that. I think it's the guardrails that they're supposed to have to prevent us from distorting things, for the most part, don't work. They don't exist. So I've managed to make the victory parade after the United States won the war in Vietnam, which never happened. I have the victory parade in Berlin after the Nazis won World War II, which never happened. I've asked for slave owners in the United States, and I'm getting predominantly Black people as slave owners.
And this is all text prompts that you have tried out.
I've even put in white slave owners, and I'm getting Black slave owners from it. So if I'm a 14-year-old in high school doing my research project on who owns slaves in the United States, and I ask AI, I'm likely or more likely at this point to get Black people than white people. So it's very, very easy to have all these racist assumptions confirmed. And I have Nazis giving out candies to kids. I make all these things. It takes about 45 seconds to do, and it costs probably 1 cent. Anybody could do the text prompts I do. You could be 14 and do the same text prompts. And we do not have a way of dealing with it. Once those things go online and the AI trains with those images, yes, the distortions will continue and in fact get worse. And for the most part, all the archives in the world really don't know what to do at this point. We don't even have a public discussion about it, but it's already happening. And it's going to affect family albums. It's going to affect everything, people's grandchildren will not know what happened in their families because it's too easy. I have my grandmother looking like Marilyn Monroe. It's fantastic. Believe me, she did not look like Marilyn Monroe. But you can do whatever you want to do. And again, you're coming out with Adobe, with all these different companies. Here's generative AI, or Apple, here's AI in the phones. And what they're saying is, a consumer, you're entitled to whatever you want. If you don't want to look the way you look, you use a filter, become what you want. If you don't want to be, in the city you are, well, we'll put you somewhere else you want to be. No problem at all. You could do whatever you want to do. And at that point, reality is no longer shared. We don't have a shared reality. And the problem then is democracy. You cannot have a democracy when there's no shared reality. Nobody knows how to vote. Nobody knows what's going on. If you watch the debate in the United States last night, it was very clear that at least one candidate has no idea what's going on in the world. And, that's in part our media is reinforcing it. And that same candidate still has half the voters, even though that person doesn't know what's going on in the world. That's where we're in. It's not just post-internet, it's post-truth. It's a whole different planet that we're living on. And the problematic thing with imagery is we say, oh, that's a photograph, it must be real. But, if you look, I had a student at ICP here last term was talking about, social media groups of pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli. They both had fake imagery, which he pointed out. And in both cases, the response was, it doesn't matter. We know what the truth is. It doesn't matter what the imagery says anymore. We can make any imagery we want. The world can be the way we want it to be, which is the title of the 1990 book I wrote, which is In Our Own Image, The Coming Revolution of Photography. We can make the world in our own image. We're all small deities, small gods. In a consumer society, we get what we want. And the reality itself is left aside. So these are pretty crucial issues that are way beyond, just conversational. They're going to affect, society in massive ways, and they already are.
And I guess in what you're saying, the whole on-demand culture that also, kind of emerged and sparked with the internet is now also entering the terrain of photography in a way where things are, sort of can be manufactured and constructed in a way that the consumer wants.
But it's not photography. It's a simulation of photography. It's
right.
Not photographic anymore. It's a simulation of it. It's happening in pornography and child pornography. It's happening in really horrific ways in this society. You don't need real people anymore for your fantasies. You don't need real people anymore to populate any environment you want. And you're being encouraged to do it by the big corporations. It's not let the memories begin, which is the old Kodak slogan. It's make your own memories whatever you want them to be, even if they never happened.
Actually, speaking about this, this very concerning issue about the credibility of images, both of you at the time actually emphasized the urgent need to understand who is behind these systems and the corporations, like you briefly mentioned, Fred, that give us the access to all these online images. And I noted down that Constant mentioned at the time we all use Google, but we don't know who initiated what we see there. And I read in my research for this talk, there is a recent antitrust lawsuit in the USA against Google, where a judge ruled Google guilty of creating this illegal monopoly on search results, basically having a lot of power over what we are consuming. And maybe, Constant, can you reflect on this role of the need to understand who is behind these systems, and also in light of what Fred just said?
So I just want to highlight that I see light at the end of the tunnel because right now, and it might dim in the future, it might get way darker, but there's a big open source community of people that are actually allowing this technology, let's say, to be reviewed, but also to have more people develop different types of things. And it's not just the commercial interest, as Google actually was. Google was hid, of course, their way that they sorted information. They tried to hide themselves as a broker of information and the middle person or the middle man, whatever, middle company in that. And that brokering, and it became very normal to allow that type of brokerage to happen in our social lives too, with like Facebook and like all these things. But I do think that there's like with this open source stuff, we actually, in a previous bit, it was said like we don't know how it works, but like we actually do know how it works. We do know what these things are trained on. We do know that like the voice of OpenAI sounds like Mr. Beast because they've been watching all these YouTube videos. We do know like all these things are coming from like, we know the sources and we can actually train our models right now. And we can actually, like we know how they dealt with copyright, and we know that there's like attempts to keep images out of these training data or data sets. So I do think that we know a lot about like how this stuff works. And I think there's a lot of people actually working with that. So I wouldn't want to phrase it like that, but I do think it's important to see that there is this tech isn't democratic, right? Like technology isn't democratic. Like the tech world isn't democratic, and like if it doesn't come from the States, like Kling AI is the Chinese effort, and it will come from a completely non-democratic source. In that sense, I just see it as like this. We've been, in truth, it's like not a photograph. It's much more like a painting. And we'll have like this generation of people that will be frustrated with the fact that the value of photography has disappeared and has dissipated in this kind of like truthful, or like this kind of the idea of photography as evidence of an argument, or like to support an argument. And I think will become much more like painterly again. It will be much more like kind of. And I think even the value of painting will change because photography will be much more like painting. So it will be much more expressive, let's say. It wouldn't be just technical, straightforward documentation. And I think, I don't know, I think it's very important to realize that these companies are trying to pigeonhole us in like specific cultural outputs and specific cultural interpretations, and maybe with these kind of guardrails to make sure that there's like a, let's say, dominant worldview that keeps us within particular guardrails. But in the end, it's painting. Why can we only create paintings that represent that type of truth? Like in the end, we'll have to look at distribution. Like these images that, we can all now generate, they shouldn't be on the front page of like the news. They shouldn't be distributed. And I think that's like a part of the problem that's actually manifesting right now.
But yeah, do you think we can control that, Fred? What is your response to this?
No, I think we have to rethink it. Last year I was part of a group with World Press Photo and Magnum Photos and National Press photographers. We started a campaign called Writing with Light, going back to what Marissa was talking about earlier. And the idea is just, you don't trust words, you trust the writer. Does the writer have integrity? You don't trust images, you trust the photographer. Does the photographer have integrity? So a lot of the big companies are trying to make it cryptographic. Can you trace how an image was modified or whatever? It's all, can you trust the technology? We're the opposite. Can you trust the human being who's operating the camera? Is that person interpreting what's going on in a way that's reasonable, in a way that has depth, that has nuance, that's important? Just like a writer, you're asking the same question. They're both authors. So that's one intention, to do it differently. But I think the sense of urgency, for an artist, as Constance pointing out, it's massive, the possibilities now. It's extraordinary. It's a wonderful time. It's a Renaissance time. But from the societal point of view of actually knowing what's going on and valuing not only contemporary photographs, but past photographs, that you show the history of Amsterdam or whatever it is. Well, I could give you, by tonight, a whole alternative history of Amsterdam in photorealistic images, and a lot of people won't know the difference. How do we protect that archive? How do we protect contemporary imaging to have that credibility so we know how to vote So we know about climate change. Is it really happening or not? Well, no, it's not happening. I don't believe any of the images. It's not happening. And then, of course, the floods come and so on and so forth. So I think these are things that all of us internationally, should be working day and night to try to figure out. It's not one person. It's got to be a connection, a collaboration among technology, among journalism, among education, among artists, among activists, to try to figure out how to move this thing forward and to actually start again, because we can't just pretend it's the 20th century. It's the old Marshall McLuhan. We can't look in the rear view mirror, while going 150 kilometers an hour. We have to look up front of us and see what's actually happening and not pretend that the past is the present, because there's a massive rupture at this point.
Yeah, and this actually, your point now made me think of a central question that emerged actually in your conversation 13 years ago, which was, is there a better system for allocating value to the images that are enveloping us? And I feel from the conversation now with you two that this question is still very much relevant, or perhaps even unanswered.
Well, Constance, go ahead. I mean, I would just add the idea of context. A photograph is made in a fraction of a second, and we assume that that's enough. When I was working curating a Magnum Photos exhibition, 40 years of history and 400 photographs, I realized that all 400 photographs were made in about 4 seconds. If the shutter is open for 100th of a second each one. So it's 1 second for every 10 years. That's not very much. So don't we need context for that? Don't we need, ways of dealing with it? I developed a software called Four Corners, where you could put each corner of the photograph, other related imagery, the backstory, witness accounts, your code of ethics. I think every photographer working in a documentary framework should put their code of ethics in a way that a reader could find it, in a sentence or two, what they do and what they don't do. As at least a transition period, because we have to rethink what we're doing. The camera never lies is now a very, very old idea. It was never true, but now it's laughable at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Constant, do you have some last words before we move towards the Q&A about this idea of a new value, allocating a better system for the value of images?
I just see a red mute thing on my corner, but you can hear me, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm just wondering, I'm just thinking about iconoclasm, as in it's this. I mean, I completely see this as a disruption on this, what we build society on, and how we communicate and how we distribute, let's say, evidence, or how we whatever illustrate and our arguments. But I'm just wondering, if Fred sees it as a kind of potential iconoclasm moment.
No, I do in a big way. I think in a really important way. The more I work with AI, the more I understand to what extent photography is a construct. It can be. It's just something that we've agreed on to have a certain amount of credibility. There are many ways of doing things, and I think many other ways. I've worked with AI that shows me things I didn't even imagine. Photography is limited; it can't photograph the future. It cannot photograph the distant past. It's not very good at internal processes like thinking and dreaming. AI is much better at all of those things. So, for example, if you're worried about your city going underwater because of climate change, you can ask scientists, what are the predictions if we don't do anything, and make AI images showing in 30 years Amsterdam underwater if we don't do anything at that point. And in that sense, you don't wait for the photographs to show the disaster. You use the AI to be proactive to prevent the disaster from happening. So I think there are many, many, many uses. The issue of iconoclasm, is a much bigger one. But I think even on a practical sense, it's very good to disrupt photography in certain ways and think of other ideas of How do you meld past and future, present, and so on? AI is very, very helpful in those ways. It's also incredibly helpful as a curator. There's billions or trillions of images online, and AI can be very, very helpful at sorting them out. I only want images taken on, Tuesday in Belfast, or, whatever it would be between 1990 and 1992. AI could be very, very helpful in things like that. So there are many, many uses, but again, it's a separate form with its own, ways of looking at things and constructing things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fred. I think this gives us a lot of food for thought on the responsibility that we also have in sharing, creating, and believing, I guess, images and our relationship to photography in general. Thanks both of you, Constant and Fred, for your insightful remarks. I think we could speak for a very long time about this, but I also have to look at our time. I want to invite Marisa back to the stream to open up for our Q&A. We got some questions in, but if you have questions, please post them in the chat for our speakers. Hey, Marisa. Maybe to start off, and I'll start, perhaps with you, Constant. Repeating the question that was asked basically to all of you 13 years ago, what's next? What's next for photography? How would you now, in light of the things that we've discussed tonight, how would you answer this question, Constant? What is next? Or is that very difficult to predict?
If you allow me, there's a two-sided. I do think that the training of a model, and if you see a model similar to, let's say, cliche, that you would make a print from, you would make a stamp from, so you could generate the same kind of outcome in all these different variations with like slight variables, and you can use things like latent space and like kind of style wanderings. And I think this is a remarkable time in which we can discover all these things which are very akin to human creativity. So I think that's a beautiful way, and we're also dismantling kind of this whole mysticism of human creativity. But I think that's what's happening. So I do see this kind of iconoclasm, also like a depreciation of like human creativity coming up, of course. But what I'm also interested in is thinking and asking in this group, actually, like, how do you view the current timeline we're in from that perspective? If you put yourself back in the time we were at that time, as in like the conditions, could you have imagined the state that we're in now? Because we're dealing with big data and we're dealing with like filtering and like all this and distribution. But like, could you imagine that this type of dismantling or like potential iconoclasm moment was happening? And do you view it as a dark timeline in like a kind of dark sci-fi moment, in like a kind of Black Mirror moment still? Like just like everybody was thinking we were caught in a Black Mirror episode during the pandemic. How do you view this? Like, yeah.
I am sorry. I thought you were finished. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Constant, but I personally would just answer that by saying yes, yes, yes. I mean, I think, again, harkening back to the cultural history of technology, I keep thinking the phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And these things really follow patterns of evolution. I've spoken about this before, probably in front of you, where there's similarities between cycles of development and new technologies and the ways that they're rolled out and embraced, et cetera. And that was sort of part of what I was trying to hint at in my talk. And I think that I definitely... It feels hard to predict what's next now, but I like your question, could you have foreseen this? And in a way, it feels foreseeable, yes, because it feels like it adheres to a pattern, especially when you think about where these technologies tend to come from, which is the military, the police, the state, and then how they tend to get used. And that's pre-programmed. But I think that Fred's point, I'm really thinking a lot about what Fred was saying when you think about past, present, and future and images, because I'm thinking about how there's this tendency now to not want to post as much on Instagram, let's say. People are kind of saying, you know, oh, I enjoy going to an event and not posting about what happened. And yet there's this idea that we're all kind of now, we generally agree that, okay, we live in this image saturated world. There are just too many images. There's information overload, which I've written about and almost kind of debunked to some extent in The Guardian. But at the same time, we do live in an image saturated world. And I think that because of that, when we encounter traumatic moments or moments that are really intense, there's almost this, we almost forget to take images. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but there have been so many times when I've thought to myself, oh, I wish I had a time machine so I could go back and take an image of this big thing, or I could screen cap this big event or this thing that happened. Because we take photographs all the time, but in the really significant moments, those are the ones where it doesn't really occur to us to take the images anymore. And it's almost an inverse of the kinds of historical moments that Fred was talking about, in my experience. I don't know if you guys have the same experience.
No, to me, it's really not the technology. It's the culture that surrounds it. So,
Yes.
you know, it was pointed out by Paul Stuckey, who's a musician, that in the United States, the big picture magazine was Life, which was about life. And the next one was People, which was not life, but just people. And then the one after that was Us magazine, which wasn't about people. And after Us magazine, we had Self magazine. And then, you know, Time magazine cover was just, you know, me, the individual. And it's a consumer entitlement. And what, you know, the technology doesn't surprise me. What surprised me is the corporate self-involvement in terms of profit, and selling the quote unquote users, the term we usually use for people addicted to drugs, which we became, making us users, and then letting us to believe that reality is not good enough. So we're going to enhance it. You know, all these terms, like when I started writing about this in 1984, we talked about manipulation of images. Then they changed it to enhancement of images. It made it better. You know, the previous was photography is dialectical. It's about what's out there. It's us, the reader, and we're looking at stuff that we may not have expected. It's a surprise. Wow, I didn't realize I gained 12 kilos, you know, in the self-portrait. Well, in a selfie, you don't realize that anymore. It's not a self-portrait. It's not introspective. It's a form of branding, you know, which is kind of imitating the corporate model. About 20 years ago, they put the lens on the camera backwards. So it became about me, the photographer, not about the world that I'm looking at. And so that inversion has, you know, created a place in which the AI and computational photography is not moving to expand our view of the universe, is moving to limit it to what we want it to be in a very self-centered, consumer-entitled way. If the technology did the opposite and said, whoa, you know, you're photographing on the main street in your town, the technology will show you what it looked like 50 years ago in that same spot, 100 years ago in that same spot. That would be interesting. They're opening up your horizons, your vistas, you're understanding it differently. You know, you're photographing a bank, you know, all these rich people. But look, 100 years ago, there were all these poor people living here. Wow, that's great. The technology is allowing them to see more than just the present. That would be very, very nice. So there's all kinds of uses that could be done. The technology inherently isn't bad. It's just the way we're using it or being forced to use it in this way that really doesn't open us up to anything. It closes us down into a very, very tribal, self-centered way of looking. So that, you know, there's more images of ever before, but I would, you know, guess that we probably know less about the rest of the world than we ever did in many ways. Not always, but in many ways.
This actually relates to an audience question, which I want to turn to because I want to give the audience also a chance. There is a question from Jan Posma for you, Fred, which relates to what you just said. He asked, do you think that we, as the general public, are capable of learning to not trust our own eyes, to see images and instinctively understand them as constructs?
I think we have to. I think that's what media literacy is about. I think we've managed to do it with food, for example. You know, we have fast food. We know what that is, but we don't necessarily trust it. Is that really food? There's other ways of thinking about food. We have, you know, these local food movements. It's in journalism or other ways. We have slow journalism, slow photography, you know, different ways of thinking. So I think, you know, we cannot just automatically trust imagery. We have to be skeptical, in many ways use our own common sense and so on and so forth. None of us is perfect. The New York Times just ran a quiz of 10 AI videos yesterday, day before, and I've been in this field over 50 years, and I got 7 correct, which were AI and which weren't. I can't even trust myself at this point. So none of us can do it. We need help. But yes, I think all of us have to be skeptical, and I think we should be teaching, you know, in elementary schools, primary schools, children about that as well, all the way through, as well as older people, everybody. But I think we don't want to teach media literacy because so much of advertising and politics depends on us not being able to decipher imagery. If an attractive man or woman stands next to an automobile, we buy it, thinking we'll be, you know, in the in club. If we were media literate, we would actually ask, does the car work? Is it too expensive? Is what we want? We wouldn't be fooled. And that's the end of the advertising industry if we actually ask those questions.
Marisa, I see you waiting to respond.
Yeah, well, I do think that it's just worth briefly pointing out that most of our conversation has revolved around forms of media. So social media, advertising, publications, etc. And there really are so many other forms of photography. And I think that I kind of tried to highlight that in my talk. And I do think that these forms of media that we're focusing on tend to dictate forms of content and methods of distribution. But you know, I think that you talked in the beginning in your introduction about cameraless forms of photography. I was talking about medical forms of imaging. There's AI, which, you know, we have now forms of imaging that take out humans entirely. We have mechanical production of images leading to mechanical interpretation of images. And so, I mean, my answer to what's next in images is just being able to cram as much information into a single image and a single pixel or a single unit, whatever those units evolve to become, as possible. So for instance, one of the examples that I gave was about being able to put a full spectrum of color into a pixel instead of a pixel only being an individual color. But one thing that I just want to sort of highlight from a cautionary perspective, I know we're tight on time, is that in the history of optical devices and image-making devices, it's long been inspired by the body, the way that we make them and the way that we consume them. And right now, there's this impetus where a lot of people think they're being these sort of tech saviors or tech warriors, trying to make disability-related image-making devices. And I think it's really, really important to put out a word of caution that it's so important to engage people with disabilities if you're going to do something like that, because I do think, harkening back to what Constant was asking about, these technologies follow a path of evolution, and I think that it's going to continue to follow this path. that it's been on of being influenced by the body and not incorporating the input of people with disabilities. And I think it's a really dangerous path to be on. So as a person with disabilities, I just felt like I should, if we're going to talk about the future, I wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. And speaking actually about the evolution of this evolution of technology, there is another great question from the audience that Constant, maybe you want to again look into the glass bowl and give us some insight on this. There's a question from Addy who asks, will the iPhone 22, I think we're at 16 now as of today, will the iPhone 22 still have cameras, or will it instead generate whatever we live or dream? What do you think about that, Constant?
I don't know, like if you generate an image, there's like all this understanding, let's say, like there's a lot of understanding of what an image entails that's in generating an image. And I think Fred actually really eloquently put that of like, but like how to dream, but I also actually think that there's like a lot of information of like what constitutes a croissant or something, as in like what constitutes your loved one. You know, that's a way of depicting that person. It's a way of like, it's like, it's an angle through which you photographed. It's a bias. It's like a repeated bias that's maybe comforting for you to look in your own pictures. Maybe it's, like it was weird because like a lot of AI stuff was always dealing about like removing bias, which is impossible. Of course, you can't remove bias from any data set. And then as in like you can remove and attack it, but like you can't remove all biases. That's what I'm saying. Like, and then in the end, there's also like preferences hidden within that, and culture hidden within that even. And I think that this is something which will always be this kind of like personal engagement, as in like not even accounting for the nostalgia of like people now going to like analog film cameras and like these throwaway cams and stuff. But I do think that there will always be this kind of like narcissistic moment of like wanting to see your own bias replicated. And I do think that like the camera itself will be the most straightforward way to do so. And although I do think like a lot of people will maybe it might be much easier to just like add some more of your personal bias, like that there's no just a general beauty filter, but there's a you filter. It will just make like the images way more you, and like way more like just satisfactory to you, because it just knows like all the images of that you've been looking back at, and it could just like feed you the stuff you want. We'll just be in the matrix. We'll still be taking pictures though.
Good. That's what we hope. Looking at the time, I want to wrap up with one last question, perhaps for you, Fred, because I also know that you have a group of students in front of you, and I know, in fact, that there are quite some photography students listening in today. You already mentioned it briefly in our conversation that these are actually quite grim times on a society and democracy level, but pretty exciting times on an artistic level. What would your advice be, or maybe some famous last words, in their future journey, starting their practice as photographers or as image makers or visual artists? How can they contribute in this landscape, would you say?
Well, I think that we're about to look at their assignments, which was interactive portraits, in which they're asked to make a portrait of somebody and then show them the image and ask them, does this represent you? It's really you. And then record their voice. So that becomes part of the image. So you can click on it and hear. So the idea really is that photography is quite static. It has to reinvent itself, be reinvented. I think Robert Capa, if he were alive, and I'm speaking from ICP, which is founded, in his spirit, would probably win World Press Photo Award today. I don't think there's any other medium where a filmmaker, novelist, painter from the 1930s would still win the major award. Photography has been very reactive. It's been, I have the camera, F8 and be there, I show it, and it got stuck in this kind of sense of its own authority. I think that's a massive mistake. There is no that same authority that it used to have. None of it wasn't all merited in the past either. But I think now what you can do is really reinvent the medium, use it in different ways, combine it, in a multimedia platform with, audio, video, whatever you want, use AI in appropriate ways, and also, share the power. Like in doing an interactive portrait, you're not the one deciding who the other person is in a portrait. You're part of the collaboration, but they also have their own opinion. They're not your subject anymore. They're your protagonist. And I think there's many, many, many things like that that are already happening in the field, and more of them that need to happen. So I think it's really the best time to enter the field. You have more tools, more possibilities, more distribution, there, but you really have to be quite thoughtful in reinventing it and not just think that if I do it the way they did it 50 years ago, everything is okay. It doesn't work anymore.
Right. Thank you so much. We will all part with this sort of critical awareness that is necessary, which maybe actually brings us back to the very start where Marisa highlighted on the post in post-internet, which is also critically reflecting on the internet itself. We've come to the end of this first Photography is ... event. I want to thank our wonderful speakers, Marisa Olsen, Constant Dillard, Fred Richen, for all your valuable insights. You can give them, again, a virtual applause in the live stream through the emojis or in the chat. We also want to thank Cultuurloket Digital for making this event series possible. And of course, a big thank you to all of you who are joining in our live stream. If you're interested in this Foam magazine issue that we've discussed today, I'm sorry, the physical copies are unfortunately, or thankfully for us, after 13 years, sold out. However, if you buy a digital subscription to Foam magazine, you get access to the entire archive, including this issue. But also for you, we have a special link with free access to this specific issue for 1 week from tomorrow onwards, I believe. So keep an eye out on your email, and we'll share the link, and then you can read all the nice contributions. Also visit foam.org/explore, our digital platform, to stay up to date with all the exciting things happening. The Photography is ... series will also continue there.
Yeah, our next event will finish the sentence Photography is ... with the word hoarding. This event will take place Wednesday, October 16. And the speakers for this event will be published soon, so keep an eye out on our socials. And before we totally wrap up this event, we will invite you to join us again on the Miro board and share your answer to the sentence Photography is. On the board, you also find some interesting articles and research that we use to prepare this event. Feel free to add your own thoughts or your own takeaways from today's discussions. Maybe you can add some unanswered questions there. We'd love to hear from you. So hop on over and while we're closing off this stream, let's continue the conversation in Miro. For now, have a nice evening and hope to see you in October. Bye.
See you soon.